Germany, 1944. Part 1. Whispers of Faith. Germany, 1944. The cold air crept through the cracks in the wooden walls of the attic, wrapping itself around the room's occupants like an uninvited guest. Esther sat in silence, her back pressed against the splintered wall, a worn blanket draped over her shoulders. The small attic, once used for storing forgotten furniture and old keepsakes, had now become a refuge, a fragile sanctuary from the horrors of the world outside. The attic was cramped, its low ceiling forcing everyone to huddle closer to the ground. Dust floated lazily in the dim light that seeped through a small, dirt-covered window, casting an ethereal glow on the faces of those inside. Esther's mother, Miriam, sat nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the lines of worry etched deep into her face. Her father, David, leaned against the far wall, his eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. For weeks, they had been hiding in this attic, living in the shadows, hoping that the world would forget them. Outside, Germany was a land torn apart by war, with soldiers patrolling the streets and the constant threat of discovery looming over them. Esther had heard the stories, families like hers disappearing in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Fear was a constant companion, but there was something stronger that had taken root in Esther's heart: faith. At 22, Esther had already experienced more pain and loss than most people endure in a lifetime. She was born into a Jewish family, but her heart had been touched by the teachings of Christianity. In secret, she had converted, finding comfort in the words of the Bible and the promise of salvation. Her family had accepted her choice, though it had done little to shield them from the dangers they now faced. The persecution against Jews had reached a terrifying peak, and despite her conversion, Esther knew she was not safe. As the days turned into nights and the nights into an endless blur of waiting, Esther clung to her faith. She spent hours in prayer, seeking solace in the quiet whispers of God. Each time she opened her Bible, she felt a warmth, a sense of peace that momentarily drowned out the fear gnawing at her soul. But as the weeks dragged on, that peace began to wane, replaced by a growing unease. Something was stirring within her, something she couldn't yet understand. One night, as the moon cast its pale light through the window, Esther lay awake on her thin mattress. The silence in the attic was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of her father shifting in his sleep or the soft murmur of her mother's prayers. Esther closed her eyes, letting her thoughts drift, and that's when she felt it, a warmth spreading through her body, starting from her chest and radiating outward, as if she had been touched by an invisible hand. Her heart began to race, but it wasn't fear that gripped her. It was something else, something divine. Esther's eyes fluttered open, but the attic had disappeared. In its place was a vision, vivid and clear. She saw a family, huddled together in the corner of a dark room. Their faces were unfamiliar, but their fear was unmistakable. A mother holding her child, a father standing protectively by their side. They were hiding just like her, but they were in danger. Esther could feel it in her bones. Their time was running out, and they needed help. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Esther breathless and shaken. She sat up, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket to her chest. "Lord," she whispered into the stillness, "is this your will? Are you showing me the way?" The warmth remained, a quiet reassurance that settled in her heart. Esther knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that God had spoken to her. He was guiding her, showing her the path she must take. But the enormity of what she had seen weighed heavily on her. How could she, a young woman hidden away in an attic, possibly save another family? The dangers outside were real and immediate. Soldiers patrolled the streets, searching for those in hiding, and anyone caught helping a Jew faced unspeakable consequences. The next morning, Esther rose early, the vision still fresh in her mind. She couldn't ignore it, couldn't push it away. It was as if the hand of God was pushing her forward, compelling her to act. Her parents noticed the change in her almost immediately. Miriam watched her daughter with a concerned gaze, sensing the turmoil behind Esther's calm exterior. David, always the protector, studied her closely as they gathered around a meager breakfast of stale bread and water. "What is it, Esther?" her father finally asked, his voice low but steady. Esther took a deep breath, meeting her father's gaze. "I had a vision last night. God spoke to me." Her voice was quiet but firm, filled with a conviction that surprised even her. "There's a family. They're in danger. They need our help." Miriam's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "A vision?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Esther, it's too dangerous. You can't leave. The soldiers, they're everywhere." David remained silent, his brow furrowed in thought. He was a man of faith, but he was also a man who understood the realities of the world. "Esther," he said carefully, "you know the risks. If you're caught—" "I know, Papa," Esther interrupted, her voice firm. "But I can't ignore this. God is calling me to act. If I don't help them, they'll die. I can feel it." There was a long, heavy silence in the attic as her words hung in the air. Miriam's eyes filled with tears, and David looked away, his jaw clenched in frustration. Esther knew what they were thinking, the same thoughts that had plagued her since the vision. How could she leave the safety of the attic? How could she put herself in such grave danger? But she also knew something else, something more powerful than fear. She knew that God had a plan for her, a purpose greater than hiding away in the shadows. "I don't know how," she admitted softly, "but I believe God will protect me. He wouldn't have shown me this if there wasn't a way." David sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Faith is a powerful thing, Esther," he said quietly. "But faith alone won't keep you safe from the world outside." Esther stood, her resolve hardening. "It's not just faith, Papa. It's His will. I have to go." Miriam reached for her daughter's hand, gripping it tightly. "If you must go," she whispered, "then go with God. But promise me you'll be careful." Esther nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude for her mother's quiet strength. "I will." With nothing but a small bag of bread and a water flask, Esther prepared to leave the attic. The cold wind bit at her skin as she stepped outside for the first time in weeks, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She looked back at the attic, where her family remained hidden, and whispered a prayer for their safety. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and began her journey, her footsteps guided by faith and the quiet whispers of God. As she walked through the misty countryside, her heart pounded in rhythm with the prayers on her lips. Each step felt like a leap of faith, but Esther knew she was not alone. She could feel the presence of God with her, a comforting hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward her destiny. And so, Esther embarked on a journey that would change not only her life, but the lives of countless others, a journey of faith, courage, and divine intervention. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and fear, but Esther's resolve was unshakable. She knew that God had a plan for her, and she would follow it, no matter the cost. Part 2. A Divine Encounter. Esther's footsteps echoed softly through the dense, fog-filled forest. Each step was deliberate, her heart both heavy with fear and light with faith. She felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her shoulders, but her trust in God kept her moving forward. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the trees towered above her like silent guardians, their branches stretching towards the heavens. Somewhere in the distance, the faint call of a bird broke the stillness, but otherwise, the forest was eerily quiet. She had been walking for hours, following nothing but the feeling deep inside her that God was leading her to something or someone. The vision she had seen the night before had been so vivid, so clear. The family she had seen was real, and they needed her help. She could not shake the image of the mother's desperate eyes, or the way the father had stood protectively in front of his children. They were hiding, just as she and her family had been, but Esther knew they didn't have much time. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, Esther's breath caught in her throat. Through the mist, she could see the outline of a building, a church, standing alone in the forest like a relic from another time. The structure was old, its wooden walls weathered by years of neglect, but there was a quiet majesty to it, as if it had once been a place of great refuge. The doors were slightly ajar, a silent invitation. Esther approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed the heavy door open with a creak, stepping into the cool, dimly lit interior. Dust floated in the shafts of light that filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the worn pews in muted shades of red and blue. The smell of age and abandonment filled the air, but Esther felt a sense of peace wash over her. This place, despite its decay, was holy. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly together in prayer. Her eyes closed, and she whispered a prayer for strength. "Lord, guide me. Show me the way. I am here, ready to do your will." As she prayed, a feeling of warmth and comfort spread through her, just as it had when she first received the vision. But this time, there was something else, a presence, someone watching her. Esther's eyes fluttered open, and she turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a man, his figure partially obscured by the shadows. He stepped forward into the light, revealing a face lined with age and weariness, but also with kindness. He wore simple clothing, a long coat and a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, but what caught Esther's attention was the small cross that hung from a chain around his neck. "I didn't mean to startle you," the man said, his voice low and gentle. He moved closer, his eyes studying her with quiet curiosity. "Are you lost?" Esther shook her head, her heart still racing. "No," she said softly. "I was sent here." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful. "Sent here? By whom?" Esther hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. But the warmth in the man's eyes reassured her, and she felt that this, too, was part of God's plan. "I had a vision," she began, her voice steady. "God showed me a family. They're in danger, hiding. I don't know exactly where, but I believe I was led here to find them." The man's face softened, and he nodded slowly. "You're not the first to come to this church seeking refuge," he said, his voice filled with both sadness and understanding. "Many have passed through here, searching for safety. We do what we can to help." Esther's heart leaped with hope. "You help them? You hide them here?" The man, whose name was Lucas, gave a small nod. "For a time, yes. This church, it's a safe place, but not for long. The soldiers search the forests, and we've had to move many to safer places beyond the hills." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Lucas' face, but he seemed to gather himself quickly. "I believe you were sent here for a reason, Esther. If God is guiding you, then we must follow his will." They sat together in the dim light of the church as Lucas explained the network of Christians who had quietly organized to help those fleeing persecution. Esther listened intently, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. This was bigger than she had imagined. The church was just one part of a larger effort to save lives, and now she was a part of it. "There are families still hiding," Lucas said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "Some we haven't reached yet. But if you're having visions, if God is speaking to you, perhaps you can help us find them." Esther felt a surge of purpose swell within her. She had known from the moment she received the vision that she couldn't stay hidden in the attic forever. This was her calling, and now she had allies in her mission. "We have to act quickly," Esther said, her voice resolute. "The family I saw, they don't have much time." Lucas nodded in agreement, rising to his feet. "I'll gather supplies. We can set out before nightfall. But be warned," he added, his expression turning grave. "The roads are not safe. We must move cautiously and trust that God will protect us." As they prepared to leave the church, the sun began to sink lower, casting the forest in a deep orange glow. Esther felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. She was stepping into the unknown, but she wasn't stepping alone. God was with her, and now Lucas was too. Together, they would follow the path that had been laid out before them, no matter how dangerous it seemed. Before leaving, Lucas led Esther to a hidden door behind the altar, revealing a small room filled with blankets, food, and medical supplies. "This is where we bring the families," he explained. "For those we can't move immediately, they stay here, safe for a time." Esther's heart swelled with gratitude. This church, forgotten by most, had become a sanctuary for the lost and the desperate. She knew then that this was where her journey had truly begun. The vision had led her here for a reason, and now it was up to her to carry out the will of God. With supplies in hand, they stepped out into the cool evening air, the sounds of the forest enveloping them once more. The weight of the mission ahead pressed down on Esther's shoulders, but it was a burden she was willing to bear. She had been chosen for this task, and with Lucas by her side and God guiding her every step, she knew she could succeed. As they moved deeper into the forest, the church faded from view, but its memory remained in Esther's heart. It was not just a building. It was a beacon of hope, a symbol of the faith that would carry them through the darkest of times. And so, with the moon rising high above them, Esther and Lucas set out on their journey, their hearts full of faith and determination, ready to save the family Esther had seen in her vision. It was the beginning of something greater than either of them could have imagined, a journey of divine purpose and unimaginable courage. Part 3. The Rescue. The city lay before them like a sleeping giant, its streets lined with darkened windows and the faint glow of lanterns flickering in the distance. Esther stood at the edge of the forest, her heart pounding as she took in the sight of the buildings rising against the starless sky. Beside her, Lucas adjusted the small bag of supplies slung over his shoulder, his face set in grim determination. The journey to the city had been long and fraught with tension, each step through the dense forest a reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the trees. But now, as they prepared to venture into the heart of the city, the stakes felt even higher. They were about to enter the lion's den, where soldiers patrolled the streets and fear hung in the air like a thick fog. Esther took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment to steady herself. She whispered a quiet prayer, asking for strength and guidance. "Lord, be with us," she murmured, her voice barely audible. When she opened her eyes again, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was where she was meant to be. This was the path she had been called to walk. Lucas, sensing her resolve, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low but filled with understanding. Esther nodded. "Yes, I am." Together, they made their way toward the city, their footsteps soft against the dirt path that led from the forest. The closer they got to the buildings, the more the sounds of the city reached their ears. The distant clatter of footsteps, the occasional murmur of voices, and the ever-present hum of tension that seemed to permeate the air. The city itself was a labyrinth of narrow streets and tall, crumbling buildings. Many of the houses had been abandoned, their windows boarded up and doors locked tight. But Esther knew that within those walls, families were hiding. Families like the one she had seen in her vision, waiting for a miracle. As they approached the edge of the city, Lucas motioned for her to stop. He glanced around, scanning the area for any sign of movement. "We have to be careful," he whispered. "The soldiers patrol these streets at night. We'll have to move quickly and stay out of sight." Esther nodded, her pulse quickening. She had known the risks, but hearing them spoken aloud made them feel all the more real. Still, she could not let fear stop her. The family she had seen in her vision needed her, and she would not abandon them. They slipped into the shadows, moving swiftly through the narrow alleyways between the buildings. The city felt like a ghost town, the silence broken only by the distant sound of boots on cobblestone and the occasional creak of a window shutter in the wind. Esther's heart raced with each step, but she felt God's presence with her, guiding her through the maze of streets. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the building Esther had seen in her vision, a small, nondescript house at the far edge of the city. The windows were dark, and the door was barely hanging on its hinges. It looked like any other abandoned home, but Esther knew better. The family was inside, just as she had seen. Lucas nodded toward the door, his expression grave. "This is it," he whispered. "We need to be fast." They approached the door cautiously, Lucas pressing his ear against the wood to listen for any sounds from within. After a moment, he glanced at Esther and nodded. It's safe." With a quick, quiet movement, Lucas pushed the door open, and they slipped inside. The air was cold and still, and the interior of the house was shrouded in darkness. Esther's breath caught in her throat as they moved through the small, empty rooms, her heart pounding with each step. She could feel the presence of the family, even before she saw them. They were here, hidden, waiting. In the corner of the small basement, Esther finally saw them. The same family she had seen in her vision. A mother huddled with her 2 children, their faces pale with fear. The father stood beside them, his eyes wide as he watched the strangers enter. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with tension and uncertainty. Esther stepped forward, her heart swelling with emotion. "We're here to help," she said softly, her voice trembling with both fear and compassion. "God sent me to you." The mother's eyes filled with tears as she clutched her children closer to her. We thought no one would come," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. Esther knelt beside the family, reaching out to take the mother's hand. "You're not alone," she whispered. "God has been with you all along. We're going to get you out of here, to safety." Lucas moved quickly, handing the father a small bag of food and water. "We have a safe place outside the city," he explained. "But we need to move now. The soldiers could be close." The father nodded, his expression filled with both gratitude and fear. He helped his wife and children to their feet, and together they followed Esther and Lucas out of the basement. The night was darker now, the city streets even more dangerous than before, but Esther felt a calm settle over her. She knew they would be protected. She had seen it in her vision. They moved through the alleyways, staying close to the shadows as they made their way toward the outskirts of the city. Every sound made Esther's heart race. A distant shout, the clatter of boots. But they pressed on, their steps guided by faith. As they neared the edge of the city, Esther heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soldiers, marching closer. Her breath caught in her throat, and she glanced at Lucas, who motioned for them to stop. They pressed themselves against the wall of a building, holding their breath as the soldiers passed by, their voices low and indistinct. For a moment, Esther thought her heart might burst from the tension. But then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the soldiers moved on, their footsteps fading into the distance. Lucas let out a quiet breath of relief. "We're almost there," he whispered. "Just a little further." They continued on, their movements quick and cautious, until they finally reached the forest at the edge of the city. The trees loomed above them, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Esther felt a wave of relief wash over her as they stepped into the cover of the woods. They were safe for now. As they moved deeper into the forest, Esther glanced back at the family they had rescued. The mother held her children close, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. The father walked beside her, his face a mix of relief and disbelief. Esther's heart swelled with emotion. They had done it. They had saved this family, guided by God, protected by faith. But even as they made their way toward the safety of the hidden refuge in the hills, Esther knew their work was far from over. There were still others out there, others who needed saving, and she would not rest until every family she had seen in her visions was safe. As they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, Esther whispered a prayer of thanks. She had followed God's call, and he had led them to safety. But the journey was not yet complete. There was still much more to do, and Esther was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Part 4. A Test of Faith. The refuge nestled deep in the hills was a hidden sanctuary, shielded from the eyes of those who sought to bring harm. Esther stood at the edge of the clearing, taking in the small cluster of wooden cottages, each tucked beneath the protective canopy of towering pine trees. The air here was cooler, fresher, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled her lungs as she breathed deeply, thankful to be away from the dangers of the city. The families they had rescued huddled together near one of the larger cottages, their faces etched with both relief and exhaustion. The children, though quiet, clung to their parents with wide eyes, their innocence betrayed by the fear they had witnessed. Esther's heart ached for them. She knew that no child should have to endure such fear, but she also knew that here, in this hidden place, they were safe for now. Lucas, ever the calm and steady leader, busied himself distributing blankets and food to the new arrivals. His quiet efficiency was comforting, and Esther found herself admiring the way he seemed to know exactly what to do, even in the most uncertain of times. He had been doing this for longer than she had, and his experience showed. But despite his outward composure, there was a weight in his eyes, a burden he carried for each life they saved, and for each life they couldn't. Esther watched as Lucas knelt before one of the children, offering a kind smile as he handed over a piece of bread. The child, no more than 6 years old, took it cautiously, his wide eyes flicking between Lucas and his parents. The mother gave a nod of thanks, her voice too hoarse to speak. They were safe, but the scars of what they had endured lingered like shadows over them. As Esther helped settle the family into one of the cottages, she felt the familiar tug in her heart, the same pull that had guided her every step of the way since the first vision. She knew this peace was temporary. There were others out there still in hiding, still afraid, and still waiting for someone to bring them to safety. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep and the families rested in the warmth of their newfound refuge, Esther found herself drawn to a small clearing at the edge of the camp. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. The quiet of the night was soothing, but Esther's mind was restless. She knelt in the grass, her hands clasped together in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, her voice soft in the stillness, "what would you have me do next? I know there are more who need our help, but I don't know where to go from here." For a moment, there was only silence. The cool breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, and Esther closed her eyes, waiting, hoping for some sign of direction. And then, as if carried on the wind itself, she felt it, a warmth spreading through her chest, the familiar sense of God's presence wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Her heart began to race, and her mind cleared as the vision took shape. She saw another group of families huddled together in a small, dark room. The fear in their eyes was palpable, but there was something else there too, a flicker of hope, a hope that someone, somehow, would come for them. Esther's pulse quickened. She knew where they were. She knew what she had to do. The vision faded, and Esther opened her eyes, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The sense of urgency pressed down on her, heavy and unrelenting. She couldn't wait. She had to act now. She stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, and hurried back to the camp where Lucas was sitting near the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. His expression was calm, but the lines of weariness around his eyes were more pronounced now, the weight of their mission resting heavily on his shoulders. "Lucas," Esther called softly as she approached. He looked up, his brow furrowing in concern at the intensity in her voice. "I had another vision." Lucas set down the piece of wood he had been whittling, his eyes locking onto hers. "Tell me." Esther sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted what she had seen. The families, the dark room, the overwhelming sense that time was running out. Lucas listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. "We need to go to them," Esther said urgently, her voice steady despite the rush of emotion she felt. "I know where they are. We have to move quickly." Lucas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Esther, we've done so much already. These people need us here to protect them, to keep them safe. I don't know if we can risk another trip right now. The soldiers are becoming more vigilant. It's getting harder to move through the city unnoticed." "I know it's dangerous," Esther replied, her voice firm but filled with compassion. "But we can't leave them behind. God is leading me, Lucas. I can feel it. We've been called to save them, just as we've saved the others. We can't stop now." Lucas stared into the fire for a long moment, the flames reflected in his eyes. He was weighing the risks, Esther knew, balancing the safety of those they had already rescued with the lives still waiting to be saved. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll go, but we'll need to be careful. We'll leave at dawn when the city is quiet. I'll gather what we need." Esther felt a rush of relief and gratitude. She knew the risks, but she also knew that this was what they had been called to do. There was no turning back now. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Esther and Lucas set out once again. The path back to the city was familiar now, but that didn't make it any less perilous. Every step felt heavy with the weight of the unknown, but Esther's resolve never wavered. She knew that God was guiding them, that He was with them every step of the way. As they approached the outskirts of the city, the streets were eerily quiet. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Esther's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her focus on the task ahead. They had to reach the families before it was too late. Lucas led the way through the narrow alleyways, his movements quick and cautious. They slipped past the silent buildings, avoiding the main roads where soldiers were likely to patrol. Every creak of a door or distant footstep sent a jolt of fear through Esther's veins, but she kept moving, her faith keeping her grounded. They reached the building Esther had seen in her vision just as the city began to stir. The room inside was dark and cramped, just as she had seen. The families were there, their faces filled with both fear and disbelief as Lucas and Esther entered. "We're here to help," Esther said softly, her voice steady despite the urgency in her heart. "We're going to get you out of here." The relief on their faces was palpable, but there was no time to waste. Lucas quickly assessed the situation, handing out small rations of food and water to the families as they prepared to leave. The journey back to the refuge was more perilous than before. The city was waking up, and the presence of soldiers was more noticeable. At every corner, they had to stop and wait, listening for the telltale signs of approaching patrols. But through it all, Esther felt the steady reassurance of God's presence, guiding them safely through the maze of danger. By the time they reached the forest, the sun was high in the sky, casting dappled light through the trees. The families they had rescued were exhausted but safe, and as they made their way back to the refuge, Esther felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. They had done it. Once again, they had followed God's call, and once again, He had led them to safety. But even as they reached the refuge and the families settled into the safety of the hills, Esther knew that their mission was far from over. There would always be more to save, more lives to protect, and she would continue to follow God's call for as long as it took. As the sun set over the hills that evening, Esther knelt in prayer once more, her heart filled with gratitude and resolve. She had been chosen for this task, and she would see it through to the end, no matter what lay ahead. Part 5. A Legacy of Faith. The war had ended, and the world, once consumed by darkness, was beginning to heal. Germany, once divided and ravaged by conflict, was now a place of tentative hope and reconstruction. Cities still lay in ruin, but life was slowly returning. People emerged from the shadows, families were reunited, and the long, difficult process of rebuilding had begun. For Esther, standing in the very church where her journey had begun 2 years earlier, the air felt both heavy and light. She looked around at the now-restored sanctuary. The abandoned building that had once been a hidden refuge for the fearful had been transformed back into a place of worship. The pews, which had once collected dust, were filled with people. People whose lives had been touched by Esther's courage, her unwavering faith, and the divine mission she had followed. It was a day of celebration, though not in the usual sense. Today, the church was not just a house of God, but a place where the stories of those who had been saved were shared, where the acts of faith that had carried them through the war were remembered. And at the heart of it all stood Esther. She was no longer the young woman who had once been driven by visions alone. Time had tempered her, but it had also deepened her faith. Her hair was longer, tied back neatly, and her face, though still soft and kind, carried the traces of hardship and endurance. But her eyes remained bright, filled with the same fire that had carried her through the darkest days of the war. She had seen miracles, and she had been a part of them. As she stood before the congregation, the soft murmur of voices quieted. People from all walks of life filled the pews, families she had saved, others who had heard of her deeds and come to hear her speak. The weight of their attention rested on her, but Esther was calm. This was not about her, she reminded herself. It had never been about her. It was about faith, and about the God who had guided her through it all. Esther stepped forward, her hands gently clasped in front of her, and began to speak. "Many of you know me," she started, her voice steady but soft. "You know my story. You know that during the war, I had visions that guided me to families in need, visions that saved lives." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. Esther paused, taking a breath, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "But what you may not know," she continued, "is that every step of the way, I was terrified. I didn't know if I would survive. I didn't know if I would be able to save anyone. There were moments when I doubted, when I wondered if I was strong enough to carry out what I believed was God's will." She glanced out at the faces in the crowd, seeing the understanding in their eyes. They too had known fear. They too had faced the unimaginable. "But through it all," Esther said, her voice growing stronger, "I felt God's presence with me. In every moment of doubt, in every moment of fear, He was there. His hand was on my shoulder, guiding me, strengthening me." She paused again, letting her gaze travel over the room, over the families she had saved. They were a living testament to the power of faith, to the miracles that had unfolded in the darkest of times. "I didn't act alone," she said softly. "I was never alone. It was God who led me, who gave me the courage to step out into the unknown. It was His will that brought me to those families. It was His love that protected us. Every life that was saved, it was through Him." Tears welled in the eyes of some in the crowd, but there was also a deep, abiding strength in their faces. They had lived through the terror, but they had come out the other side, stronger and more united by the faith that had carried them through. One of the families Esther had saved, the mother, father, and 2 children she had found in the basement of the city, sat near the front of the church. The mother's eyes met Esther's, and there was a silent exchange between them, one that spoke of gratitude, of shared experience, of a bond that could never be broken. Esther smiled gently at them, before turning her attention back to the rest of the congregation. "There were moments," she continued, "when I didn't think we would make it, when the darkness felt too great. But in those moments, I remembered the faces of those I had been sent to save. I remembered the hope in their eyes, the belief that someone, somehow would come for them. And I couldn't give up. I wouldn't." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "We all have a purpose, a calling. For me, it was saving those families. For you, it may be something different. But we must always listen for God's voice, for the ways in which He calls us to act. Because it's in those moments of fear, of doubt, of uncertainty, that He shows us who we truly are." The room was filled with a quiet, reverent stillness. Esther could feel the weight of their attention, the way her words were resonating in their hearts. "There is always hope," she said softly. "Even in the darkest times, there is hope. We just have to trust in it, to hold on to it, even when it feels like it's slipping away." She paused, her eyes scanning the room one last time, before she offered a final prayer. "May we all continue to walk in faith, to listen for God's voice, and to follow the path He lays before us. And may we never forget the miracles we have witnessed, the lives that have been saved, and the love that carried us through." The congregation sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of Esther's words. Then, slowly, they began to rise to their feet, their applause soft at first, then growing louder as they expressed their gratitude not only for her, but for the faith that had guided them all. After the service, Esther remained in the church, speaking with the families she had saved, offering words of comfort and encouragement. Many had questions about her visions, about how she had known where to find them. But Esther always answered the same way. "It wasn't me," she would say with a gentle smile. "It was God." As the evening wore on and the congregation began to leave, Esther found herself alone in the quiet sanctuary. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light through the stained glass windows, bathing the room in a soft glow. She knelt before the altar, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. "Thank you for guiding me, for giving me the strength to do your will. I will carry your love with me, always." And as she knelt there, In the quiet of the church, Esther felt a deep peace settle over her. The war was over, the families were safe, and her journey, though long and difficult, had been worth every step. Her legacy, born out of faith and courage, would live on in the hearts of those she had saved, in the stories they would tell, and in the lives they would continue to touch. And Esther, ever faithful, knew that God had been with her all along, guiding her through the darkness and into the light. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.